Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone joining us today. My name is Jessica Taylor, and I'm here at the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation in Ottawa, Canada. On behalf of CEE, I'd like to welcome you all to the fifth installment of our Environmental Evidence Summit webinar series. This session is plotting a course for strengthening the conservation evidence base, integrating multi-actor perspectives. This series was created to replace the in-person event that was to be held here in June, and we'll continue with monthly webinars until June of 2021. As the session will end in breakout groups, I'd like to take the time now to thank you all for joining us today and invite you to join us for our first session of the new year, Evidence Syntheses and Eco-Health, Exploring Interactions Between the Environment and Human Health and Wellbeing. So registration is now open on our website. I'd also like to thank our chairs for today, Natalie and Judy, and all of our presenters for what will surely be an interesting session. So with that, I will pass it off to Natalie.
All right, thank you. Does everyone see my screen?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Jess, for having us as part of the Environmental Evidence Summit series. My name is Natalie Dubois, and I'm a Senior Research Specialist at Environmental Incentives. I'll be co-chairing the session today with Judy Bashoven, and Judy and I have supported biodiversity programs at the United States Agency for International Development as part of Measuring Impact and Measuring Impact 2. I want to start off by thanking USAID for supporting our participation in this webinar, and I'll let Judy introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Judy Bashoven. I'm a Senior Project Manager at Foundations of Success, and we're a conservation NGO, but not the type that does the work on the ground. Instead, we help funders, practitioners, and educators manage successful projects, demonstrate conservation impact, and influence decision makers. Nice to be here. Thanks.
Okay, so I can't advance the slides. There we go. All right.
There we go.
So welcome to our session today, where we hope to have a really interesting discussion around the theme of how we as a community of practice work together to strengthen the systems by which we generate knowledge about the effectiveness of conservation interventions. For the first part of our session, we've invited a panel of speakers who will share different perspectives related to the use, generation, and synthesis of evidence related to conservation effectiveness. And then in the second part of our session, we invite you to join us in small breakouts where we'll work together. And after today's session, we'll use the outputs of this discussion to develop a set of actionable recommendations that can be implemented by stakeholders and their institutions. If you're interested in receiving the report out, you can let us know at the end of the breakouts. And for those of you who are listening to the recording, the breakout workspace will be viewable after the webinar, and there'll be a bit.ly link in the last slide of the presentations. The idea for this session actually started with a lunch over full bowls of steaming hot noodles in Kuala Lumpur, where Sam, Biljana, Judy, and I were attending the International Congress for Conservation Biology. Judy and I had just attended talks by Sam and Biljana about using evidence synthesis into decision-making, and Judy and I had been presenting talks about our work supporting the use and generation of evidence in conservation projects. And we realized that there were still a lot of assumptions underpinning our expectations for how evidence users and evidence producers could and were engaging with each other. Originally, we had planned this session as a roundtable, but here we are today, hoping to engage all of you in a wider discussion about the interdependencies between evidence users, evidence producers, and those involved in evidence synthesis. Using and generating relevant and credible evidence is becoming widespread in conservation practice as a means for improving the effectiveness of conservation interventions. In this context, evidence synthesis has emerged as an important tool for addressing the knowledge needs of decision makers. However, even when researchers invested in evidence synthesis ask practice-relevant questions, the status of the existing evidence base frequently precludes robust inference about the effectiveness of the conservation interventions that are being studied. The question we're addressing today in this session is, how can we work together to increase the efficiency by which we collectively build knowledge about the effectiveness of conservation interventions? Today, we're going to explore the spaces in which evidence users, producers, and synthesizers work, and importantly, what must happen in the spaces in between these functional groups to ensure that users of evidence can acquire knowledge about the effectiveness of conservation interventions to inform decision-making. Within these functional groups, we have sets of actors with similar roles who are responsible for various outputs related to building knowledge about effectiveness. If we work backwards from that knowledge base, we see that there are many different actors involved who are dependent on each other for various inputs and outputs. That is, multiple actors must coordinate their actions to build knowledge about the effectiveness of conservation interventions. Let's start from a place where evidence users recognize that there's a gap in knowledge related to a conservation decision. If this knowledge gap is due to a gap in the evidence base, evidence users need mechanisms to motivate producers to generate appropriate evidence, which might come from primary research or from implementation outcomes and evaluation. Sometimes this is relatively straightforward, particularly if a single actor functions as both an evidence user and evidence producer. For example, conservation project implementers can be both users and generators of evidence, facilitating the alignment between what users need to know and the evidence that is produced. But we also have situations in which evidence users must rely on other actors to produce evidence aligned with their information needs. In this situation, users may require additional mechanisms to align the outputs of evidence producers with their information needs. Sometimes the evidence being generated feeds directly back into decision-making. For example, a donor organization might monitor and evaluate their projects to adjust and adapt their investments at the portfolio level. Another path from evidence producers to evidence users relies on evidence synthesis, which brings together information from a range of sources to inform decision-making. But when that evidence base is weak, synthesis can also reveal gaps related to conservation effectiveness. We have quite a few examples where these linkages work well, and probably some where they do not. The question we're exploring today is whether there are opportunities to make these pathways more efficient so that we build the knowledge base more quickly, and if so, what that might look like in terms of how actors engage with each other across these spaces. Maybe another way to look at it is it time to ask ourselves if we are learning quickly enough to bend the curve of continued biodiversity loss? The system may be working, but are there ways that we can make it work faster? Coming up, we'll have a series of 5 10-minute talks where our speakers will share perspectives related to how they use, generate, or synthesize evidence related to conservation effectiveness. We've intentionally invited speakers to showcase different functional spaces across our diagram, and we hope that after their talks, you will join us in breakout groups to add your experiences to the conversation. I'll pass over to Judy now, who's going to provide an overview of what you can expect in the breakout groups that we'll have, and then afterwards we'll head directly into our lightning talks. So Judy?
All right, so Natalie's given an overview, and then we're going to have our lightning talks, and then we're going to go into breakout sessions. So we'll be ending this webinar and going into Zoom rooms. But the overview for the breakout is that we want to discuss where the opportunities are to strengthen the linkages in the pathway for knowledge generation about conservation effectiveness that Natalie just described. And we hope that you join us to contribute your ideas and share your experiences in strengthening this pathway. Are there untapped opportunities or new ways that actors and their institutions can engage with each other? So we're going to invite you to jot down an active listening sheet. So as we're listening to the lightning talks, we thought that you could prepare yourselves for the breakout sessions by taking out a sheet of paper and dividing it into these 3 quadrants. So the first one is parts of the pathway that are working well and who's involved in that pathway working well. so that's the plus. Then the minus is parts of the pathway that could work better, and who would be involved in making it work better. And then the last quadrant is what can actors do differently to make the pathway work better. So if you can, take out a sheet of paper and jot down those questions and take notes during the lightning talks to prepare yourself to participate. And we also want you to click on the link in the chat box right now. There we go. And you're going to enter a breakout workspace. If the link in the chat box isn't working for you, you can go to a bit.ly link that's shown. There it is on the top in the highlighted section there. So you should go to these Google slides here. This is our workspace for the breakout rooms, and we want you to sign up for a breakout session. And first you'll decide what functional group you best represent or work most closely with. And then we want you to try to distribute yourself across these different breakout sessions. So we're all going to be talking about the same pathway, the same 3 questions that you jotted down for your active listening worksheet. But we'll have 4 different groups, and then decide if you're an evidence user, evidence producer, evidence synthesizer, and put down your initials in the appropriate cell and try to distribute yourselves. So if you see a lot of initials already in the purple group for your functional group, then maybe choose to be in the green group to distribute ourselves. So if you could do that, that would be great while you're listening to the lightning talks. Then once we listen to the lightning talks, Zoom links will appear in this slide down at the bottom. We'll go back, we'll end our GoToWebinar session, and you'll click on your Zoom link and join your breakout group according to the color, and your facilitator will be there to greet you. Did I forget anything, Natalie?
No. All right, let me switch back. All right, so we're going to move over into our series of lightning talks here. I want to remind you to please type questions into the question box during the talks, and we're going to hold questions until the end. So we'll have Judy and I will be reviewing the questions as they come in, and we'll pull them up to talk to our panel at the end of the talks. All right, and so our first speaker today will be Sarah Carlson, and Jess, I think we're going to switch over to her deck. Great. All right, so our first lightning talk today is presented by Sarah Carlson. Sarah is an environment officer at the United States Agency for International Development in the Center for Environment, Energy, and Infrastructure. An evolutionary biologist by training, Sarah has worked at USAID for 8 years, where she leads efforts to better integrate research and evidence in the design and adaptive management of USAID biodiversity conservation programs. Sarah will be talking today about USAID's role as an evidence user, the opportunities and challenges to using evidence in USAID's biodiversity programming, and what evidence-informed decision-making looks like in the agency's policies and programs. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Natalie. And thanks also to the organizers for inviting me to be on this great panel. So going back to Natalie's pathway, I'm going to speak from the perspective of a donor organization and an evidence user. So first, I'll speak a little bit about how we use evidence at USAID, and then about some of the constraints that we face and also opportunities. And then I'll close by providing an example of how my office has navigated some of the arrows in Natalie's diagram. So first, a little context about AID. So we're a large government donor, and this means that we work within a large bureaucracy, which has both challenges and opportunities for evidence use. Last year, we supported conservation activities in around 60 countries around the world as part of the US government's foreign assistance. We have a biodiversity policy that governs our work with an overall vision to conserve biodiversity for resilient, sustainable development. So why do we care about evidence at AID? Well, as stewards of taxpayer money, we want to make sure that our programs are having the biggest impact possible, and programs designed without evidence are fundamentally risky. There is also an urgency to our work. With biodiversity declining at very high rates, we don't have a lot of time to spend resources on approaches that don't work. So how do we use evidence at USAID? We use evidence to make decisions at many different levels, and this can be at the policy level, which can be international, national, or agency policy, like the biodiversity policy I showed a minute ago. We also use evidence to inform agency strategies, which help us set priorities, goals, and targets for certain sectors or countries. And finally, we use evidence to make decisions about our programs, what types of activities we want to fund. And this programmatic level is what I'm going to talk about today. And specifically, we have a strong need to understand what kinds of conservation interventions work and are worth investing in. We have a very supportive policy environment for evidence-based practice at USAID. In 2019, the US Congress signed the Foundations of Evidence-Based Policymaking Act into law, which mandates all US government agencies to use and also generate evidence while fulfilling their missions. The USAID policy that guides how we design and implement programs, which is shown by that exciting looking document in the middle, mentions evidence 74 times. And we have an agency-wide framework called Collaborating, Learning, and Adapting, which sets best practice for applying evidence to the adaptive management of all USAID programs. But despite this high-level support, it turns out that using evidence in our day-to-day jobs can actually be quite difficult. So to understand how environment staff use evidence, my office at USAID, through a project called Measuring Impact 2 that Natalie mentioned already and that both Natalie and Judy work on, conducted 2 assessments to understand the constraints and incentives for evidence use. So the first examined staff working on biodiversity conservation programs broadly, and the second took a deeper dive into a specific technical area that's a high priority and where we really need to get our programs right, and that's combating wildlife trafficking. So one of the main findings was that evidence is often unavailable on the timescale needed to make decisions. So due to programming pressures, we may not have time to wait for a comprehensive systematic review to inform a decision, for example. Next, evidence does not always come in a form that is useful. Sifting through piles of documents and scientific papers and then translating the findings into your program context is not always possible for busy staff. And finally, our analyses showed that there are sometimes not enough staff with the right knowledge, skills, and abilities to apply evidence to our work. We rarely have staff entirely dedicated to this, but rather it's an extra task on top of an already packed portfolio. Our analyses also looked at incentives for evidence use among staff, and hands down, the #1 incentive for using evidence was to achieve better project outcomes. Staff also reported opportunities for thought leadership as an additional incentive. So we found a deep appreciation for taking an evidence-based approach, and the constraints, it turns out, are largely practical and logistical in nature. So one of the main take-homes from these studies was that we need to make it easier for staff to use evidence. And one thing that really helps is a common taxonomy of conservation approaches. So we have a common language to talk and think about our work. And so at AID, we use the Conservation Measures Partnership IUCN taxonomy of conservation actions, which is shown here in the slide. And recently we conducted an analysis of our biodiversity portfolio of over 100 programs to see which approaches USAID most commonly uses. And it turns out we tend to support some approaches more than others. So for example, one of the approaches we commonly use is conservation enterprises. And this is a subset of alternative livelihoods, which I think most people are probably familiar with. And these are businesses designed to generate economic and social benefits that motivate communities to conserve biodiversity. So an example of this would be ecotourism. So what is the evidence that this approach works? It turns out that the evidence is mixed. So a systematic review from 2015 found that only 8 of 18 conservation enterprise projects had positive outcomes for conservation. So, not great. And this, of course, doesn't mean that the approach doesn't work across the board, but really pointed to a gap in the evidence base. So what do we do with this information? We decided that we needed to dig into this approach a little bit more because it's so prevalent in USAID's work. And the first step was to develop a shared learning agenda among USAID staff, mostly based on our missions around the world. And Judy led this effort for the Measuring Impact 2 project. So I'm going to be presenting a lot of her work. So the centerpiece of the learning agenda is a theory of change that describes how conservation enterprises are supposed to work, or the hypothesis or model behind the approach. And then from this, we developed learning questions to help examine the assumptions behind the approach. We identified 5 major assumptions along the theory of change. The learning questions helped us structure the evidence that does exist. So this document shows an analysis that used the 18 studies included in the systematic review I mentioned previously to look for evidence for each assumption in our theory of change. In other words, we took a deeper dive on those studies and organized the evidence according to our theory of change. Next, we packaged this information into a guidance document called Keys for Success, which identified conditions that influence conservation outcomes in these types of programs. And so the idea is that a USAID staff person who's thinking about designing a conservation enterprise project could refer to this to see if this approach is likely to be effective in their context, or maybe identify some complementary approaches they would need to implement alongside it. And then finally, we distilled this down even further into a checklist to make it even easier to apply the evidence to decisions. So this gets to the barriers I talked about earlier. We tried to make it as easy and efficient as possible for staff to use the existing evidence to make decisions. But we're still operating in a context where the evidence base is relatively weak for this approach. So we're also encouraging our projects to collect relevant data to contribute to the evidence base through a common monitoring framework. So we're also in the position to produce evidence or encourage the production of evidence rather as a donor. And this takes us back to Natalie's diagram, where we're also contributing data along that top dashed line, connecting the evidence users to the producer. So I'll just end with a few take-home messages. So first, for those who are scoping evidence syntheses or producing evidence, keep the evidence user in mind, or better, involve them in the process. Next, common taxonomies of conservation approaches really facilitate understanding among the different actors in the pathway. And then finally, theories of change and learning agendas can help structure evidence in a form that is useful for decisions. And with that, I'll close. I hope I was within my 10 minutes. And thanks very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I want to remind everyone to please type any questions that you have for Sarah into the chat box, and to go over and sign up for a breakout group if you're able to join us after the talks at the bit.ly link that is in the box in your GoToMeeting controls. Our next speaker is Samantha Cheng. Sam is a biodiversity scientist at the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History and coordinates the center's evidence synthesis activities as the first US-based center affiliated with the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. Sam works across the conservation and development sectors in support of evidence-informed practice and policy. In her talk today, she will explore how decision makers can use systematic maps to inform conservation decisions. She'll provide a framework for decision makers for using and interpreting the findings from systematic maps. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Natalie. Oops, all right, there we go. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm really excited to be part of the session today and for the discussions later on. So as I said, I'll be talking about how we interpret and operationalize the findings from evidence maps. The work I'm presenting today is the product of a Science for Nature and People working group on evidence-based conservation. And in particular, I'd like to thank my co-authors, Madeline McKinnon and Den Miller, for their work on this. So the SNAP Evidence-Based Conservation Working Group is comprised of individuals across this entire evidence pathway. So while we focus on evidence synthesis as a method and a tool in conservation, many of us in this group also wear multiple hats across these different functional groups. So we're engaged in not only producing evidence syntheses, but also in producing primary research, as well as end users aiming to gain insight to inform conservation decisions. So we're focused here specifically on evidence maps. So this is the type of evidence synthesis that's a thematic collection of primary research and systematic reviews within a sector that organizes evidence using a framework of policy relevant categories. So they can be particularly useful in aiding users to quickly assess the extent and the distribution of evidence across a broad topic area, and can aid in targeted explorations of specific areas of interest by serving as a roadmap of resources. So, however, for evidence maps and for all types of evidence syntheses, in general, there are several challenges that evidence users face in interpreting and operationalizing the findings from these maps for different types of decisions and for different types of users. So the first challenge is that maps often lack clarity and guidance on how to interpret the findings from the map. So more often than not, maps present interpretations based on the volume of evidence and less on the nature and the characteristics of these areas of high and low evidence you see illustrated in this example. So in particular, we've often heard from evidence users that it's difficult to determine what to do when a map finds that there are significant evidence gaps. Does this mean that there's no information at all, or that the information that exists isn't reliable? What do we do when we find a lot of evidence? Does that mean this is, a strong support for effectiveness? So there's just a lot of vagueness around what we do and how we interpret these. So that leads to the second challenge, in that there's a lack of guidance then for users on how to operationalize the insights that they're getting from these maps. So maps are inherently quite broad in nature across a broad topic space. So it's often difficult for users then to determine how they can actually take that and apply it to more specific decision areas and identify appropriate actions, particularly when our end users may be quite diverse, spanning a whole range of different stakeholder groups as well as decision types. So in order to address these challenges, we saw a need for an approach, a sort of evidence key that can guide producers and users of maps. So an evidence key approach is aimed to help activate decisions based on insights from evidence maps and help avoid potential misinterpretation or misuse of maps. So in parallel, this approach then can also encourage greater consistency in reporting in the production of maps, and provide guidance so that the makers of maps can provide guidance that's maximally useful for end users. So today I'm going to go over the steps in this approach and illustrate how we can apply it to interpret a case study of an evidence map on the links between conservation and human well-being that our working group produced. So based on our collective experiences in evidence synthesis and in evidence-informed conservation approaches, we devised an evidence key that's flexible for the bespoke decision needs of different types of end users. So the key has 3 steps, which guides users through evidence map interpretation and optimization. So in the first step here, the user has to calibrate the key based on the decision at hand. So in other words, individual users need to just consider what are acceptable levels of risk and uncertainty that are acceptable to inform their decision. So here there are 3 areas for calibration. First, users have to decide how much evidence is required. So establishing cutoffs for what's considered to be high, medium, and low abundances of information. Second, they must decide how robust must that evidence be. So robust study designs mean that these are research designs that are appropriate to generate reliable answers to the research question of interest to the reader, to the user. So users will have to consider factors for robustness that include research methods, indicators, sampling techniques, data collection methods, and data analyses that are pertinent to their questions. And then last, they have to determine whether or not the linkages being illustrated make sense. So the users have to decide whether or not an intervention could reasonably be expected to cause a change in measured outcomes. So how and why this happens should be articulated in theory or in some sort of case examples to determine plausibility. So in our example, we have this map of the links between conservation and human well-being, and an evidence user is interested in using that map to determine how different types of natural resource management interventions can impact human well-being in order to inform program design. So in this case, we use a quantile approach for examining the frequency of evidence. So we divide low, medium, high via quantiles. And then since we're interested in questions about effectiveness, right? How can it impact human well-being? How can we design programs? We are considering impact evaluations as our threshold for robustness. So studies which use a counterfactual to attribute effects using quantitative or some combination of quantitative and qualitative data. And we're looking for a fairly high proportion, 75% of this evidence in a linkage has to be an impact evaluation in order to qualify as robust. And then lastly, we rank plausibility based on whether or not there's existing theory that supports a causal relationship between an intervention and an outcome type. So after we calibrate our key, we have to apply it to the map. So based on these 3 settings, you would code your linkage types. And so there are 6 different types of linkages that you can find in a map. So where you have plausible relationships, you can have 4 types of linkages. In cases where there are high and medium levels of robust evidence, you would either have no gap or robust evidence. Where you may have lots of non-robust studies, this would be a cryptic gap. So while there's a lot of information there, the information there may not be as appropriate or reliable. And then in areas where you have low, medium to low volumes of non-robust evidence, you would have an absolute gap or a true gap. And then you'll have on the flip side where the linkages are not plausible, and you might have low volumes of non-robust evidence supporting a non-plausible linkage. So this would be a pretend gap where the lack of evidence may be because there's a lack of a logical relationship. But then you can also have areas where there are no plausible linkages, but there are significant volumes of non-robust studies. So this would signify that there's some sort of potential logic gap where there's a significant leap in logic. So for example, trying to link interventions and outcomes along very indirect pathways or that have tenuous causal relationships, signifying there's some sort of mismatch in logic between the intervention and the problem or outcome it seeks to address or what people are measuring. So when we apply the key to the map in our case study, we find that most of the map is characterized by cryptic and absolute gaps. And this isn't unexpected in our case because the overall volume of impact evaluations found in the evidence base was low. In our area of interest as a user of this map, we see that the links between natural resource management and the domains of human well-being are characterized by cryptic, absolute, and knowledge gap, or cryptic, absolute, and logic gaps. So what do we do with it then? So our last step then is to interpret these gaps and take appropriate action. So in cases where you have no gaps or robust evidence, this signifies that this area is ripe for future investigation into questions around effectiveness, so these deep dives. But you may also have some cases where you do have robust evidence, and also in cases where you have both cryptic and absolute gaps, where the users are going to want to consider how they can improve upon future data collection and research to build and improve the evidence base on this area. So you may want to consider expanding the search to find additional relevant and robust evidence from sources the map didn't consider, for example, perhaps from internal reports and evaluations. In cases observed here, most of our gaps were cryptic and absolute gaps. So in those cases, you'll want to proceed with caution. You can continue to delve into the evidence in that linkage and explore the nature of the gap itself. If it's the case that the evidence collected isn't appropriate or it's not reliable to inform decisions, you want to consider how you can improve the evidence base, for example, through improved and expanded monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And then lastly, in these cases of pretend and logic gaps, users might want to go back and revisit their program theory and rethink the logic behind the linkage or the logic behind their evaluation design. Oops. So the evidence key approach can be quite relevant across this entire evidence pathway. The applicability of this approach is dependent, though, on transparent reporting and consistent conduct in map production by map makers. So these folks in the evidence synthesis functional group, in order for people to actually assess frequency, quality, and plausibility to calibrate the key for interpretation. And then for map users and map liaisons, or the interpreters who might bridge the gap between synthesis and use, the key can serve as a useful heuristic for making judgments on the value of available information and helping distill and prioritize discrete actions around these quite complex issues that we're looking at in conservation. And overall, the typology that's used in the evidence key is quite generic and transferable and can apply to topic areas beyond conservation. So we think that applying an evidence key approach can help smooth and facilitate the evidence pathway between synthesis and users and producers, but it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. So it will require clear collaboration and communication across this entire pathway. So with that, I will close. Thank you everyone for listening today. I look forward to our conversations afterwards.
Thank you so much, Sam. I will remind everyone again to click over on the link and sign up for a breakout group. All of the groups are addressing the same topic, so the different colors are just ways to kind of distribute everybody across the different facilitators. So our next speaker will be Cody Day. Cody is an aquatic science biologist who works in the Great Lakes Laboratory for Fisheries and Aquatic Science at Fisheries and Oceans Canada. For the past 2 years, he's been leading research prioritization projects within the Canadian federal government and developing approaches to plan and evaluate the production of scientific information for applied environmental management. Cody's unable to present in person today, so he has prepared a recorded talk. His presentation will look at collaborative research prioritization as a method for motivating decision-relevant research. So Jess, I'll let you cue up the recording.
Morning, everyone, and thanks for joining. My name is Cody Day, and I'm from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, where I work in the Great Lakes Laboratory for Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences. And this morning, I'd like to talk to you about an increasingly common approach to identifying gaps in the conservation evidence base that I've termed collaborative research prioritization. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll understand what that means, whether or not collaborative research prioritization studies have been successful in accomplishing their goals, and how we might improve them going forward. And so collaborative research prioritization is this approach that you may be aware of, and it's characterized by 4 main steps. In my opinion, the first step is an initial step where the study leaders gather a large pool of research topics related to the field of interest for them, and they do this by identifying knowledge gaps, either through email surveys or web surveys, or potentially by doing large literature reviews. After that, there's a step where that initial pool is revised and collated to create a set of research questions. And that set of research questions is then the focus for a prioritization activity, where a large and diverse group of experts, typically involving both researchers and science users, tries to select among those research questions to identify which of them are priorities and should be priorities for future research going forward to enhance the evidence base for conservation. And so these studies have been increasingly popping up over the last 15 years or so, and they really started with the first publication that was led by Bill Sutherland that identified 100 ecological questions of high policy relevance in the UK, and this came out in 2006. After that, in 2009, Bill Sutherland again published one of these studies with a large group of authors who identified 100 questions of importance to the conservation of global biological diversity. And this was quite an interesting and influential study at the time, and created a lot of buzz both in the mainstream media and I think in the research community as well. And then a couple of years after that, we really saw an increase in the number of these types of studies that were being produced. And so, for example, in 2013, we saw 5 studies using these types of methodologies. And each year since then, we've seen at least a handful of these types of studies come out. And in total, over the last 15 years, these studies, these collaborative research prioritization studies, have identified somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,400 research priorities across 45 or so publications. And these publications have involved over 1,500 authors. So really the key question for me is have these studies motivated new research that contributes to the evidence base for conservation? And that turns out to be a bit of a challenging question to answer, but we tried to do it in this recent paper that we published in Proceedings of the Royal Society. And so, you know, on one sense, these publications are, some of them at least, are very highly cited. And so that could point towards evidence that, you know, they perhaps are motivating new research. And so the corpus of 45 publications has been cited well over 1,500 times in the last 15 years. And some of these individual studies have been cited quite a number of times, and some of them receiving over 50 citations in a given year. However, we did notice in our review that many of the citations of these studies are coming within the first 2 years after they're published. And this suggested to us that, you know, perhaps these studies are being cited for other reasons rather than directly motivating new research. And the reasoning behind that is typically for a study in the field of ecology or environmental biology, you'd think it would take more than 1 or 2 years to have one of these studies kind of spark a new idea, have that study be developed, funded, conducted, and published. And so we suggest that these citations early in the life cycle of the collaborative research prioritization studies might be indicative of these studies being cited for other means other than being direct motivators of new scientific studies. In addition to that, there's a recent paper by Jucker et al. that directly looked at the citations of one of the more influential collaborative research prioritization studies. And what they found was that 69% of the citations of that study were for reasons other than a direct motivation of new research. And so this, I think, is further evidence suggesting that while these collaborative research prioritization studies are highly cited, they're not necessarily being cited as a motivator for new research that contributes to the conservation evidence base. So, you know, I think the jury is kind of out on how well these studies work to motivate new research, but regardless of the answer to that question, I think we can ask, how could collaborative research prioritization studies be improved? And I'm going to suggest 3 methods in the remainder of my talk today that I think would help to build to make these studies more useful for both for researchers and for science users. And so the first one is to actually increase the involvement of science users and science funders in the collaborative research prioritization process. And in our review, we found that while most of these studies do involve a diverse group of individuals, they do involve academics, science users from a variety of backgrounds and different stakeholders, they still by and large are dominated by academics and by academic researchers in particular. And so academics are primarily leading these studies, and they represent a strong majority of participants in these studies. And in addition, while science users are often involved in collaborative research prioritization studies, we rarely see the involvement of science funders and individuals that represent science funding institutions. And I think this is a really a missed opportunity, because if these studies are identifying a whole bunch of new research priorities, ideally you'd like to see science funders at the table to help contribute to these processes, because ultimately those science funding organizations are going to be asked to support research to address these research priorities. Additionally, I think that it's important that collaborative research prioritization studies identify achievable and actual testable research priorities. And in particular, in our review, we noted that many of the research priorities that are identified are very high-level, broad questions that would be really challenging to answer and to address fully. And so, for example, to pick on a couple of the research priorities that were identified in some of the studies, we see examples such as this. How does management of terrestrial and aquatic food production systems affect species, ecological functions and services, and economic benefits? And I think if we try to design a study or a series of studies to address that question, I think that would be a really, really challenging endeavor. And in particular, we'd like to highlight the fact that one of the primary roles of researchers in being involved in these research prioritization studies should be their ability to kind of temper the expectations of science users and to really help define the research priorities in terms of being actual testable research questions and being actual achievable research goals. And so that's an additional step that we think could be taken to increase the utility of these collaborative research prioritization studies. Finally, we think that within the studies themselves, it would be useful if the group that's drafting the research priorities also provides a clearer path to how to address those research priorities. And so, for example, none of the collaborative research prioritization studies that we reviewed made suggestions on whether or not we actually need new primary research, new evidence, or whether or not we might need evidence syntheses to answer a given question, or whether or not other types of science products, for example, decision support tools, would be more appropriate. So I hope I've introduced you to the collaborative research prioritization approach, or at least given a name for an approach that you may have been aware of out there in the wild. And I hope that I've convinced you that these studies have identified already a large pool of priority research questions or topics, but I think they really could be improved. And in particular, I'd like to advocate for, again, a stronger involvement of science users and funders in all steps of the process, a real recommitment to focusing on achievable and testable research questions rather than these higher kind of vaguer research priorities that have sometimes emerged from these processes, and a focus on identifying the actual types of science products that would best suit the research priority and how to get there. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Great, thank you, Cody, for preparing that presentation for us. We're going to keep moving around our diagram here, and our next talk will move us more into the evidence producers space. Our next speaker will be Craig Lesher. Craig is the Director of Monitoring and Evaluation for the Nature Conservancy's Africa region, where his work focuses on measuring socioeconomic and ecological outcomes from conservation initiatives. At TNC, he led the development of a regional monitoring and evaluation system and designed a dashboard to communicate key management metrics for use in evidence-based decision-making. Craig will share a perspective from the point of view of a conservation organization and their potential role as evidence producers. His talk will explore some of the major challenges to doing monitoring and evaluation and how the Nature Conservancy is beginning to address them. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Natalie. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about section 4 here, the evidence producers. Let's see here. Did it looks like my screen stopped sharing. Can you guys still see my slides?
We're not seeing the slide deck. We're seeing probably something underneath it.
Okay, let me see. Why did I lose that? Sharing. Okay, I'm going to try to stop sharing the screen, then start sharing the screen again. It's not letting me click on. Oh, here we go. Okay.
It's still like a document.
Okay, here we go. Let's see. Main screen.
There you go.
Okay.
You're good.
So Sam mentioned the absolute gap in conservation evidence. And why is this? So by the end of my talk today, I hope you'll have a better understanding of why the Nature Conservancy generates so little conservation evidence. I'll cover the systematic challenges, the resource challenges, and how the organization is beginning to address these challenges. But first, let me start with a bit of hubris and talk about the Nature Conservancy, or TNC, itself. So for the last 3 years, TNC's revenues have been over $1 billion a year. So TNC is bigger than CI, WCS, WWF US combined. We've got 4,200 staff in 70 different countries. TNC is also a science-based organization, and we've got more than 200 staff with Google Scholar profiles. So my point here is TNC is an organization with substantial money and substantial science capacity. Yet why are we collecting so little evidence from our conservation work? Let's look first at the systematic challenges. Some of you may be familiar with the systems thinking iceberg, as it's called. That's what I'm showing here in the graphic. But if not, each level down the iceberg offers a deeper understanding of the system being examined, as well as increased leverage for changing the system. At TNC, there are a number of below the waterline challenges, but I want to highlight the mental models at the bottom. Monitoring and evaluation, or M&E, is not part of TNC's organizational culture. We don't call it out. We don't say it matters. And perhaps more importantly, TNC, like many conservation organizations, is biased towards action. In fact, some of you may know that conservation has been called the crisis discipline. And we often tell ourselves that we need to act before it's too late, and that reflection is less important right now than action. Those are some of the few of the systematic challenges below the waterline. Here are two more. Conservation often faces wicked problems. And by that, I mean problems that lack clear solutions because the problem itself is linked to other problems. And the nature of each of the problems cannot be isolated. So that's one challenge, these wicked problems. Another challenge is these complex social ecological systems where we work. And in these social ecological systems, when you change one element, it may have unintended consequences for another element. The wicked problems make it hard to generate unambiguous evidence from conservation activities. It makes it hard to know whether it was truly your activities that affected the change. The complex social ecological systems, on the other hand, tend to be unique to a location. And this hampers the generalizability of the evidence. It limits the external validity of the evidence from a particular social ecological system. So mental models, wicked problems, and unique social ecological systems are systematic challenges most conservation NGOs face in generating evidence. But there are also resource challenges, even at TNC. Over the last few years, we have created a new database, which has all of our projects with their budgets and expenses and revenues. And it's a great way to see where the resources are going in TNC and what do our projects look like from a budgeting perspective. So as of the 30th of November, about a little over a week ago, there were 758 active projects in the database for TNC. If you look at the median project budget, this is the annual budget, it's 190,000. So this is too small to support much monitoring and evaluation. But I want you to note this spike here right around the $2 million mark. A lot of public sector donor funded projects are between $1 and $3 million a year. And when we want to generate conservation evidence, it's not looking at these projects that are really small in size or smaller in size, but it's really looking at these $1 million plus projects. And it's a manageable number even for a big organization like TNC. So it's just a question of where we focus on generating the evidence. Instead of focusing on all projects, let's focus on a few. So at TNC, the way we're addressing some of these systematic challenges and some of the resource challenges are with two things, tech and teaching. So Google Earth Engine is a real game changer. If you don't know about it, it's an amazing tool. It's free. And the way it works is it takes the remote sensing data, you write a script that analyzes the data, and then it'll put out the maps in many different formats for different GIS programs. So you can now do in a matter of minutes what used to take weeks or months for a GIS analysis to do. And you can do it again and again and again simply by running the Google Earth Engine scripts. So this one is really dropping the cost of generating empirical evidence of large scale changes on the ground from our conservation initiatives. Here's a real world example of how we're using Google Earth Engine. We have a soil carbon project in northern Kenya. We wrote a Google Earth Engine script to analyze rangeland conditions using NDVI. Some of you may know that's it's a measure of photosynthesis in plants. And NDVI can be correlated with soil carbon storage. And carbon storage from improved rangeland management, that's the conservation initiative, can be quantified, certified, and sold on the voluntary carbon markets with the payments going to the local community. So it's really a payment for ecological services kind of project. And that's what we have in northern Kenya. But now we can measure our carbon sequestration using Google Earth Engine, and we can do this multiple times a year to see how we're doing year on year, and we can do it in a matter of minutes. So here we're generating evidence of our outcomes with tools like tech tools like Google Earth Engine. But we need both tech and teaching because the primary constraint at the working level, at the coal face, if you will, of conservation is the capacity of our staff and local partner organizations. It's the capacity to collect reliable and valid evidence. This is usually our major constraint. Recently, TNC approved a new monitoring, evaluation, and learning strategy for the entire organization. And the long-term goal of this strategy is to make monitoring, evaluation, learning a part of our organizational culture. Until monitoring, evaluation, and learning is part of our organizational mission and culture, it will not be fully internalized. So it's a high bar, but it's the bar that matters. But if we can do this, if we can make it part of our culture, we will finally be able to generate substantial evidence of the outcomes from our conservation work. In closing, I hope you now have a better idea of why the Nature Conservancy generates so little conservation evidence and how the organization is beginning to address them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Craig. I want to remind everybody to please keep putting questions into the chat box for our Q&A session, and as well to sign up for a breakout group if you're going to be able to join us afterwards. So our final talk of this round, it will be Biljana Matura, who will round out our trip around the pathway. Biljana is a senior research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute based in Sweden. She's an environmental social scientist with a main research focus on the synthesis of robust evidence for decision-making in environmental policy and practice. She conducts systematic evidence synthesis on environment and development topics and works on the improvement of systematic review methods. Don't see your slide yet, Biljana.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I also see just a white blank slide in this sharing window. So if I can maybe ask Jess to share the link, prompt me to share the screen again, please.
Yes, and you'll have to pick the full screen or monitor and not the PowerPoint. Oh, there you go. Thank you.
Okay. Here, so Biljana's talk will look at the linkages between evidence production and evidence synthesis, and we'll explore how searchability, methodological rigor, accessibility of data, and reporting quality of primary research can influence the findings of systematic reviews. Thanks, Biljana.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thanks everyone who presented so far for this excellent insights. Pleasure to be here. So as you mentioned, I will be talking actually about how to make sure primary research is used in systematic evidence synthesis, and we'll show how to improve the link between the primary research and the evidence synthesizers, as we call it. So why do you want your research to be included in a synthesis at first place? Why would you care? First of all, because as we heard already from Sarah's presentation, there is not enough time, decision makers have not enough time to actually go through overwhelmingly high number of results or findings that are being produced every year, more and more. Also because the context matters. So one study cannot, it will be not enough to actually answer questions about conservation effectiveness or conservation impact. It will have very low external validity, but the aggregation across different studies and across different contexts might give us more insights. Also, often research pointing towards different directions. So systematic reviews help us to understand on average what is the effect of specific interventions, or what is the impact, etc. In order to synthesize evidence, we use several different methods, including, and we call them many different names, including traditional literature reviews, systematic reviews, etc. But actually, systematic reviews are the ones, or systematic review methodology or systematic evidence synthesis is the methodology that actually is a gold standard method for synthesis of the evidence, because it tries to synthesize the evidence in a most comprehensive, transparent, repeatable way, having procedural objectivity. And in your screens now you see the steps through which the systematic reviews are being conducted. So we first identify and formulate the question with stakeholder engagement. Then we generate and publish a systematic review plan. Then we search for primary research studies that are relevant to our question and include only relevant studies according to the predetermined inclusion or exclusion criteria. Then we assign weights to different types of primary studies depending on their methodological rigor, then we finally extract and synthesize that evidence and report it. And these protocols, as I said, are being published and finally review reports. However, often we come across of once we synthesize the evidence, often these systematic reviews have conclusions, very ambiguous conclusions, because they often say that actually there is a diverse and fragmented body of evidence, that there is a limited evidence base, so there is no, the question of a review could not be answered. Often there are kind of recommendations for improving research and improving reporting, etc. So at the end, we end up with a synthesis that does not give us or provide an answer set out to provide at first place and be useful for policy and practice because of different reasons that I will try to explain. And this means that this link between the evidence synthesis and knowledge generation about conservation effectiveness is broken. So as Natalie already mentioned, and I mentioned in my initial slides, today I will actually talk to the ones who are producing evidence and trying to explain what can be done better in order to strengthen this link between knowledge generation and evidence synthesis production. Okay, so why do we have this link broken? Because there is, for us, for systematic evidence synthesizers, there is often difficulties in finding and accessing relevant research. So, and this then is producing a selection and publication bias and affecting the comprehensiveness of the review. Primary studies are often lacking methodological rigor. Because of many different reasons, and then we end up with evidence base that has a low validity or high susceptibility to bias often. We also have difficulties in assessing and extracting relevant findings because there is no accessible raw data, and then this prevents us of conducting meaningful quantitative synthesis or meta-analysis. And also often we come across poor or unclear reporting in primary research because there are no reporting standards so far that I'm aware of in conservation, for example, for impact assessments. And therefore often we miss information on the context, on the methods, etc., that are important pieces of information in order to actually conduct a meaningful quantitative synthesis or explore heterogeneity in the evidence base. However, I hope to show that there are some potentially more or less simple fixes for this. So first of all, I would recommend to think about searchability, so to improve the way how the primary researchers write titles, abstract, and keywords, because these are the three areas that we usually use to do our searches. So the more informative titles, the more informative abstracts, and the more informative keywords it's easily more easy to find such research. So often there should be information on studied population settings, intervention exposures, clearly and outcomes clearly spelled out in the abstracts. And when you write keywords, think about including both general and specific keywords, obviously. Okay, so when it comes to the methodological rigor, that obviously also depends on available resources. And as we heard from previous talks, resources in conservation might not be always available or might not be always directed towards a primary research. But anyhow, when designing studies that are assessing impacts or exposure, it's very important to control for confounding effects, use randomization or matching for that, and obviously think of collecting baseline data, think of sufficient replication, etc. It's very, very important to avoid selective reporting on findings. So report all the findings in your study, acknowledge limitations, and obviously if there are systematic reviews on the topic, they could be checked for more information on what is the gold standard kind of method to assess the impact of given intervention. Then also it's very important to make accessible information or data. So especially if obviously primary research cannot be made as accessible because of the paywalls, etc., that are provided to us, then at least gray literature could be made available on preprint servers, organizational website, and the same with data. And obviously, when you are writing your research, it will be very, very important to provide more permanent contact details, because institution emails tend to change, because contacting authors of primary research is the way how we actually accessing missing information and adding it to systematic reviews. And also transparency is very, very extremely important. So it's important to report contextual information in detail, information about studied intervention design, implementation details. Also, it is important to report all the methodological steps accurately conducted in order to arrive to conclusions of the study, describe in very much detail study designs, sampling, data collection methods, etc. And also report your findings in detail. Often we come across studies that do not report very clearly sample sizes or measures of variability. So it's very, very hard to include these findings then in meta-analysis that we are conducting as a part of systematic reviews. And it's very important to report all the findings, so to avoid selective reporting and cherry picking. And that's why primary researchers should make use of supplementary materials. And with this, I would like to thank you.
Thank you so much, Biljana, and to our entire panel of speakers today. I encourage you to type any questions that you may have, and I think now Judy is going to queue up a few that have come in through the chat box already.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. I think the first one is for Sam. The question is, I suppose the main benefits of an evidence systematic map is that it's much more rapid than a systematic review. However, to increase its usability by practitioners, are there any hybrid approaches? For example, systematic map with some narrative review based on, say, analyses of abstracts instead of full text, or would this be discouraged in the environmental synthesis community? Sam? Yep.
Thanks, Judy. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, that's a really good question around, sorry, I think there's some running water here. So that's a really good question around timing, right? So, you know, I think one of the things to consider is that a systematic map, depending on the scope of that map, may actually take a considerable amount of time. So, for example, the case study that I presented on the links between conservation and human well-being, we reviewed 35,000 abstracts and 3,000 full text in order to build that map in a comprehensive and transparent way. So I understand that, you know, when you get a systematic map and it describes sort of the overall distribution of evidence, it doesn't help in some cases where someone might have a very specific question about effectiveness. You know, the downside of looking only at abstracts is that I think we're all quite aware that abstracts don't always communicate the entire picture of what a study finds. They're often written in short formats. They're you know, written ways to often attract more traffic towards that study. And so I think looking just at abstracts is actually quite unreliable, and you're more likely to find sort of vague insights and potentially there might be some serious consequences of relying just on that. So in short, I would say if you really want to look at questions of effectiveness, you're going to have to dig into the full text of those studies. You may still have to do a narrative, you may still do a narrative synthesis, but you really should consider the quality of those studies, critically appraise them so that you can actually assess the strength of the evidence base so that you can answer these questions about direction and magnitude.
Great, thanks. We also have a question for Craig. How do you partner with folks on the ground given the remote nature of the work, like the rangelands research in Kenya?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So the way we partner is with a very deliberate process that a lot of you may know by the acronym FPIC. It's usually free, prior, informed consent, but consent is not enough when you're working with local communities. It needs to be collaboration or it's unlikely to be sustainable. So in a case like Kenya, what we're doing is collaborating with the communities on the ground. And what we see with the remote sensing analysis, we give back to the individual communities as a score on how they are doing year to year. And it gives them a way to adaptively manage their rangeland activities. Does it work? Sometimes. Yeah, not everybody is responsive to the information. I'm also not sure that everybody understands the information and what it means. So there's also sort of a liaison need that helps the local communities to be able to make the information actionable. And that's where we often have challenges. So, thanks.
Thanks. I don't think we have time for more questions. We hope that you join the breakout group. So please make your way over to the Google Slides for our workspace for the breakouts. So by clicking on that link again to enter the workspace, and then I think we're going to consolidate into one group. So we're going to do the green group. So we've moved everybody into that space, and then you will click on the Zoom link on the bottom that's in the column for the green group. So if you, I hope that you join the discussion. It'll be great, and we're going to invite people also to continue this discussion from this session and potentially participate in a paper. So hope to see you on the other side.